Sí. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming today. It's really nice seeing you here for this first press conference by the President of the General Assembly, Ms. María Fernanda Espinosa. She will make some opening remarks, and after that, she will take your questions. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Her Excellency. Madam President, welcome.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here this afternoon. I just gavelled the end of the general debate, and here I am just to report and share with you some of the outcomes of the general debate. I am sure that you all know Monica, and I'm very proud to have her as my spokesperson. I don't know and don't recall of a president of the General Assembly with a female spokesperson, and I made sure that my spokesperson was a woman. And I am very proud because it's also a person with a great career in communication and an outstanding member of the DPI team. So good afternoon again. Thank you for coming. And I have had the pleasure of meeting many of you already during the very generous UNCA reception that you organized for my team and for myself before I took office. And I'm very grateful. It was really a very good opportunity to meet you all. I think it's very good to see you again in a different capacity. And I have met some of you on bilateral on interviews already. This is indeed my first press conference, and I am sure that it's going to be the first of many others. You will be seeing me quite frequently because my work very much depends on you and the work you do for the organization. The first thing, and I think it's fair to say that I would like to commend you all for the great job you did during the general debate. It was, I know, very hectic for us, and we know that every year now. The number of events is growing, which makes our job in attending them and for you covering them even more challenging. So we appreciate what you did and what you do on a daily basis here to cover UN affairs. But I know that last week was particularly challenging. I know firsthand because I had, an average of 22 meetings per day last week. As you very well know, my presidency is focused on making the UN relevant to all people. And for that, the role of the media, of the press, is really crucial. And we count on you and your outlets to help us to bring the UN closer to the people and the people closer to the United Nations. Dear friends, let me start by expressing my solidarity to the people of Indonesia, affected by an earthquake triggered by a tsunami on the 28th of September, which hit the city of Palu, as you very well know, on the island of Sulawesi. I really am deeply saddened by the high number of tragic deaths and the scale of destruction it has caused. I have seen pictures, I have spoken with the foreign minister of Indonesia. She was here, and it is really sad, and I'm really touched by the suffering of people in Indonesia. So all my solidarity. My thoughts are also with the people of Barbados who suffered with floods caused by the tropical storm of Kirk. In Japan as well, early this morning, the typhoon Trami made landfall near the city of Osaka. And I want to tell you that the UN stands firm with the victims and at this very difficult time for friendly countries such as Japan, Barbados, and of course Indonesia. I am here today just to bring you some information about the general debate and the high-level events we had last week. As you know, the last speakers concluded the debate earlier today. We just ended at around 12:30, and then we had the closure of the general debate. This year, perhaps you have already the numbers, but we had 77 heads of state and 44 heads of government that attended the UN General Assembly. All 193 member states took the floor, and we had 196 speakers, including, of course, permanent observers to the organization. 196 speakers. We had 4 deputy prime ministers, 54 ministers, 1 vice ministers, and 8 chairs of delegation. I personally met with leaders of 50 countries, including 7 female heads of state and government that I'm very proud of. As you know, my presidency is very strongly guided by a commitment to multilateralism and an international rules-based system, in what I think has been highlighted not only by myself as president, but I would say with the ample majority of leaders that came to New York last week. And I will use every opportunity to champion the international agreements that we have brokered and that have come about through the cooperation of all member states. Since one of my 7 priorities is gender equality, I was delighted to have the opportunity to meet with female global leaders. As you know, we had about 400 side events last week, in which 50 were mandated events to the General Assembly. The exact number is being processed as I speak, but the latest I have is 400. I personally chaired 16 plenary sessions of the general debate, high-level meetings, and meetings organized by agencies and funds of the UN. I attended 7 side events and listened to as many people as possible during last week. A highlight of last week was, of course, the Mandela Peace Summit, which will resume tomorrow. We had too many speakers, so we had to accommodate to resume next week. If I can have a glass of water, I'd be very thankful. Of course, the Mandela Peace Summit, as we all know, marked the centenary of Madiba's birth. Personally, I was also very, very touched by the ceremony to commemorate the passing of the former Secretary General Kofi Annan, and I pay tribute to his work and his legacy on peace and development issues. I also had the privilege to meet the Annan family last week. I also attended a high-level signing and ratification ceremony for the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. 7 countries signed to the treaty: Antigua and Barbuda, Benin, Myanmar, Brunei, Guinea-Bissau, Timor-Leste, and Seychelles. And 4 ratified the treaty: San Marino, Vanuatu, Samoa, and the Gambia ratified the treaty. This was a great moment for multilateralism and for disarmament. I think these were very, very good news. As you know, we had also 2 very important final declarations approved on improving the health chances of millions last week. One political declaration on the efforts to end tuberculosis, which is, as you know, a treatable and avoidable disease, which still kills 1.6 million people each year. A second declaration was adopted on beating the non-communicable diseases as well. On that issue, you know that 70%, to be more specific, thank you, Kathy, 71% of the total deaths every year are caused by non-communicable diseases, such as cancer or diabetes. We now need to implement all necessary steps to make these avoidable deaths history. Here, I would like to thank the several heads of state and government for their strong commitment, as well as ministers of health and their respective delegations, which worked hard to make both declarations a reality. You will remember that I participated in other events where we discussed the road to Marrakesh on the International Conference of Morocco in December, where the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration shall be adopted. Migration and refugees are one of my 7 priorities indeed for this session. I also had the privilege to attend a meeting on economic development and migration in Africa. I spoke at other events such as the G77, ASEAN, the meetings on less developed countries, CARICOM, middle-income countries, and landlocked developing countries, or LLDCs, as we call them. A very energizing moment was the event with young people and how we can better serve them as part of the Agenda 2030 youth strategy. And as hard as it may seem, I got the chance to step outside the building to attend the Global People Summit and the Global Citizens Festival. So I had a direct contact with activists, with civil society representatives in both events. I think they were very important and encouraging events and great platforms for millions of young people and global citizens around the world. You may be interested in hearing that this year, the longest speech this year lasted 48 minutes, and the shortest lasted just under 5 minutes. That's a huge gap between 48 and less than 5 minutes. Huh? Well, the 48-minute one, Venezuela, and the shortest, Lithuania, the president of Lithuania. Lithuania. Our colleagues from DPI and Security and Safety Service tell us that 3,543 media passes were issued for journalists and 10,521 for delegates from the press, for the overall number of delegates. 10,521 delegates that this House hosted last week. Looking forward, my 7 priorities, which were chosen in consultation with member states, will be the motor that drives our agenda this year. In fact, most of the speeches held at the general debate were very supportive of my 7 priorities and of the theme that I have selected for this session. As you know, the theme, and I repeat again, is making the United Nations relevant to all people, global leadership and shared responsibilities for peaceful, equitable, and sustainable societies. The priorities, so we remember them: gender equality, migration and refugees, decent work, people with disabilities, environmental action, which include the global campaign against plastics, youth, peace and security, and the revitalization of the United Nations. Many of these priorities, of course, are cross-cutting, and we intend to implement them around campaigns and very specific actions. Some of them are already mandated to the General Assembly. For example, I will undertake a participative global campaign directed towards turning the tide on plastic pollution, as well as the role that youth has in advancing the agenda on peace and security and decent work. Here we will join forces with the International Labour Organization, with ILO, which celebrates its 100th anniversary next year in 2019. I am committed, as I have stated before, to working with all member states in this House to make this a very productive, smooth, and efficient year, to achieve very concrete results for the people we serve around the world. Finally, I would like to show you and to share with you a very, very short video, so bear with me, from one of the many special moments I had in my exchanges with people last week. I met a very brave young lady called Nandita. She lost her hearing capacities due to tuberculosis. a disease she had twice. And today she's a survivor. She became an activist and inspired me with her story. And so let's watch this very brief video if we may.
Life would never be the same for me. Thank you for asking me to speak.
In that we were very encouraged that politicians, us, we should listen more.
Do you have the conversation? It's easier.
Thank you.
Je vous remercie.
It says there that it's translated. In the UN. And I mean what I say. We need to listen more to people, the people that are out there, and translate their needs and demands into action. And I am here to do just that. My presidency is being guided by the acronym DARE, DARE, which stands for Delivery, Accountability, Relevance, and Efficiency. So we will dare, and I hope that you will keep us focused on doing just that. And thank you very much for your patience, and now I will take your questions.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The first question goes to the UNCA President, Sharon.
Madam President, thank you for coming to speak with us, and congratulations on making it through your first UNGA. My name is Sherman Bryce-Pease, South African Broadcasting. I wonder what your thoughts were when President Donald Trump, and you're going to get questions on President Donald Trump today, what were your thoughts when he stood in the General Assembly and made that statement that he had achieved more in less than 2 years of his presidency than almost any other administration in the history of the United States? The president has since spoken about that moment. I wonder what your sort of assessment was of the dynamics in the room at that time. And then, if I may, a second question, just in terms, I mean, you talked about 22 meetings per day, 196 speakers, the number of events going up. It was very hectic, you say, 400 side events. Is it not becoming counterproductive to have all this stuff going on at the same time at the UN, where we are basically achieving a great sense of fatigue rather than perhaps progress in the geopolitical ideas and goals that we set ourselves?
Well, should I just respond to every question? Okay. So on your first question, really, and I mean it, it's very hard for me to comment on the 196 speeches. You're referring to one very important member state, our host country, and perhaps I can comment on my bilateral meeting with the host country president. With regard to the many events, the many meetings, the many side events that can be counterproductive, I think that member states have mixed feelings. On one hand, indeed, there is a lot happening, perhaps too much happening at the same time. Especially, it's very challenging for your work because you want to cover it all, but it's materially impossible. It's impossible. But then you have to pick and choose and have your own priorities and look at the regional interests that you represent here, and you have to select the things that you're going to follow. But on the other hand, it's very difficult to limit the right of member states to come here, to organize events, for example, share progress, good practices on implementation of Agenda 2030, on their issues regarding peace and security, on issues of migration, on issues of refugees, climate change. It's because we are 193 member states. And of course, heads of state come. Of course, they have to make, full use of the time they're here in New York. So on the one hand, there is this general sense of we need to mainstream, we need to be more efficient, we need to have less events perhaps. But on the other hand, we have also this pressure because every member state, they have the rights, and also the connection between, it's also the opportunity of programs and agencies of the UN to connect with their constituents, which are member states and countries. So it's very difficult to limit the amount of events and meetings that are going on in the House. But what I think, and I am convinced, that this is a very strong message. The highest number that we have had in terms of media, in terms of ministers, in terms of heads of state and government, is because the world cares about the United Nations. And the world cares about multilateralism and the need to strengthen the multilateral agenda. So I think that we have mixed feelings, but we will take that into account when we address these issues of the working methods of the General Assembly and the revitalization process. So we will discuss that, and we will just try and take a decision, a collective decision, on how to address this, I would say, paradoxical yet complex issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go to AP. Edith?
Thank you very much, Madam President. Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. After listening to all of those speeches, I wonder what you come away with as really the major concerns that the world has today. And did you come up with any ideas of how to address them? And what surprised you most about what you heard?
Thank you, Edith.
First, I have to say that I had members of my team, of the cabinet, just listen to every single speech. And I had a summary every day because I could not be present for all the 196 speeches. But we are making an analysis and assessment. We will do a document with, the critical issues for an assessment of the general debate. But what I can tell you is that perhaps the most, recurrente, we say in Spanish, recurrent issues were the issue of climate change, conflict prevention, and multilateralism. I think these were the three, and perhaps in the second line, the issue of migration and refugees and the global compact. These are the issues that were perhaps the most, addressed by heads of state and government. Climate change, with no doubt, especially from the countries with special situations and the most vulnerable ones, such as the small island developing states, for example. So I would say that, but we will come up with more concrete and specific numbers of the themes that were addressed during the session, but that is Mare. And also, I would say almost a unanimity on the need to strengthen multilateralism and to strengthen the role of an organization that is irreplaceable, which is the United Nations.
We're going to try to get...
Surprising?
Well, I wouldn't say,
Was anything surprising to you?
not really. I think we were expecting, our leaders to just address the issues that they did during the speeches.
Thank you. Al Jazeera, James Bay. Thanks.
James Bayes, Al Jazeera. Madam President, you've mentioned multilateralism several times and said that that everyone agreed on that. I have to come back to the speech of President Trump because obviously it gets a lot of media attention. It comes very, very early. And he seemed to make a speech about sovereignty and questioned whether we were drifting towards global governance. And then we had almost a right to reply from the French president who seemed to directly take on President Trump, although he didn't address him directly. And we heard similar things from the German foreign minister and others. There seems to be a big battle of ideas out there about the way the world should be run. You are the president of the General Assembly, the guardian of multilateralism in some ways. How do you see this debate?
Well, I think that sometimes we think that there is non-compatible concepts, and I think that they are. On one hand, the strengthening of multilateralism and collective action to address common threats and common challenges. On the other hand, the very, fair exercise of national sovereignty and to look after national interest. Both issues can be combined. And we heard, both, different voices during the general debate. What I can tell you is that I had a very constructive yet and fruitful bilateral meeting with President Trump, and we did address the issue of how important it is to make the UN more efficient and more relevant to all people. We discussed particularly that issue. We discussed the very important role that several countries are playing, for example, on very critical issues on peace and security, such as the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So I would say that this is the house for dialogue, is the house for consent, but this is also the house to listen to different views and perspectives on the key issues.
We're going to try to get to everybody. So I'm going to hand over to Evelyn, the Huffington Post, and then the second.
Thank you. Evelyn Leopold,
Thank you.
Independent Media, and Dag Hammarskjöld Fund for Journalists. In the crucial issue of refugees and migrants, the main purpose seemed to be to exchange best practices and ideas. Do you see anything coming out of that very large forum that can be used in the future?
Well, absolutely. I participated in a very good event organized by the Special Envoy on Migration, and the Foreign Ministry of the Kingdom of Morocco. I think that there is great expectation of the conference, the Marrakesh conference in December. There were opportunities for countries to bring their good practices, and I think that there is wide, political commitment to make the Global Compact a reality. The world is in need of a shared framework in order to ensure orderly, regular, and organized migration, and that is going to require a great deal of political commitment. And I felt that there is indeed political commitment. I would say that we will have a very successful and well-attended conference in Marrakesh in December.
Do you see that framework, or is it too early?
Well, no, not at all. We have a document. It's going to be formally adopted in Marrakesh. And now, after Marrakesh, we have a very challenging process, which is to establish the mechanisms for implementation of the Global Compact. And the General Assembly is going to work on that. I will appoint 2 co-facilitators to ensure that the post-Marrakesh will ensure proper implementation of the Compact.
Go ahead, Joe,
Yes.
and then the colleague behind.
Thank
and
you.
Back to Hamid.
Thank you. Joseph Klein of Canada Free Press. The A in your DARE acronym, accountability. I'm wondering what steps specifically you're going to take to either continue or even build on your predecessors' measures to ensure transparency, disclosure of all financial transactions and personal financial disclosure, but also sources of funding for the General Assembly office to avoid the corruption that we saw in previous presidencies. Thank you.
I think this is a very good question, and I think that we need to build on what my predecessors have done on this issue. I had promised full disclosure, full accountability of the office, and we will do so. I am, sitting in my desk just for a week, but we have taken all the measures to ensure disclosure. This is not only financial disclosure. The trust fund is going to be, you can access to the trust fund and every contribution to the office through our website in terms of financial disclosure, the same procedure, but also accountability in terms of informing about my agenda, my travel, the work of my cabinet. Everything is going to be out there, made public. There are no secrets in my presidency, and I'm permanently also available to you as journalists to any special request or question that you may have.
Okay, go ahead.
Madam President, my name is Solomon Serwanja. I work for NBS TV and also a RAF fellow. Making the UN relevant is one of your core goals, and Africa spoke with one voice, calling for reforms at the Security Council, that they should have at least permanent seats in the Security Council. Do you see this happening during your tenure? Is it something that can see the light of day?
Well, this is a question. I know that Security Council reform, it's one of the most perhaps contentious yet interesting processes in the House. This process has been going on for the last 25 years. We have established an IGC, an intergovernmental negotiation process 10 years ago. The process will continue under my tenure, of course, but this is very much a member state-driven process. I will ensure that I pick the right persons in order to push the process ahead, and it's very much going to depend on the depth and the readiness of member states to give, the reform process the shape and the depth that they are willing to provide it.
Thank you. I see lots of hands. Hamid and then the colleague over there. Yes. I'll go back to you.
Thank you, Senora Presidente. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi, although Monica calls me Hamid as former colleague. I have two questions. First, on the issues discussed in the Security Council originally, this used to be discussed in the GA. Many of the issues had been transferred from the GA to the Security Council, issues like development, children, armed conflict, roots of conflict, poverty, even youth is being now discussed in the Security Council. Probably nothing left really for the GA. What is your take on that? And this all happened after the end of the Cold War, and I can narrate to you how many of the issues were discussed in the GA and now moved to the Security Council, leaving almost nothing to the GA. And the second question, from listening to so many speeches, the question of Palestine had been repeatedly mentioned by many, if not all, delegates. What is your take on that? What is, in your opinion, a just, viable, possible solution of the question of Palestine? Thank you very much.
Regarding the relationship between General Assembly and the Security Council, basically, I think one of the good practices of my predecessor was just to hold monthly coordination meetings with the General Assembly, and I will continue to do that. I think it is extremely useful to meet and coordinate the work between the principal organs of the United Nations. I will undertake monthly coordination meetings with the Security Council, with the ECOSOC as well, to make sure that we are all in the same page and that our respective planning is coherent and we do not overlap or and we increase our efficiency. The second issue is that it's not that every issue is being just pushed to the Security Council. I think the opposite also happens. We do have the resolution, which is called Uniting for Peace, that allows the General Assembly to take over the issues that, for a reason or another, cannot be solved within the Security Council. I have to tell you that this General Assembly has more than 40 mandates for this session, more than 15 high-level events and conferences to be organized, and that we indeed are the Parliament of Humanity. We are the norm-setting body of humanity. So the importance of the General Assembly is huge. It's huge. And I think that we will continue to perform and comply with the mandates of member states on the 3 pillars of the Charter, on human rights, on sustainable development, and on peace and security issues as well. Regarding peace and security, we know that the primary organ is the Security Council, but the General Assembly undertakes issues that are connected to the other 2 pillars as well. The issue of Palestine and the Middle East. Basically, since I was a candidate for the PGA position, I have stated that we are in debt with the Palestinians and the Palestinian people, and I have called for the compliance of the existing resolutions on the matter. The only way that we will find, a sustainable and long-term peace in the Middle East and the well-being of the Palestinian people is through dialogue and peaceful means. So I very much encourage that all member states comply with the already existing resolutions on the Palestinian issue and on the peace processes in the Middle East.
Okay, the colleague over here and then here. Yes, we're going to get back to you, Susan.
Madam President, congratulations on your big job. My name is Irene Hell. I report for the Copenhagen Post. I think it is really crucial that you make the UN relevant again. And I wish you lots of success and energy for this extremely important task. The key issue is basically the funding of the UN, the funding of the UN development goals. And the second thing which worries me very much is the populism, that now more and more self-interests of states are taking over, and the populists are taking over globally. So what can we journalists do, and what can the UN do, and what will you do to re-invoke the spirit of the global family, which is now much more needed than ever with all these catastrophes and crises? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Well, I think that you have touched on a very critical issue, is the commitments we make as member states then have to face material obstacles. Basically, the issue of funding. That is one of the major challenges, for example, of the complying with the Paris Agreement, climate finance. I think that we have instruments in hand that are extremely powerful, such as the Addis Abeba action agenda, financing for development. I think that the transfer of resources and capacity building from the wealthy countries to the countries with special needs is still something that is pending, and we need to do more and better. The same goes for ODA. I think that we need to do more and better and take into account the special needs of vulnerable countries. For example, when talking about climate, the small island developing states, the landlocked countries, the least developed countries, but also the middle-income countries that have to face special challenge, very specific challenges to deliver on Agenda 2030. Let's look at what just happened in Barbados. Let's just see what happened in Dominica last year. 80% of their existing infrastructure got dismantled by a hurricane, which means that they need to get credit from the multilateral banking system. They need to rebuild, and they are in constant rebuilding processes. So these particular situations should be taken into account. And as I say, we have already existing commitments and frameworks, such as the Addis Abeba action agenda. The issue of populism, I think that the strongest and perhaps most efficient response to that is multilateralism. It's global leadership, it's collective action. And I have stated that very strongly and in a very bold way during my opening statement to the general debate. And I think that that's why practically all leaders of the world that spoke at the General Assembly spoke about how important it is to make the United Nations more relevant to all people. the response is multilateralism and collective leadership and action.
Thank you, Madam President. In order to accommodate all hands I see up, we're going to have to limit to one question only. And I'm going to go to the back and then back here. I'm aware of all your requests. I have the colleague here and afterward Pamela there. Yeah, thank you. If you can just say your name and the outlet, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Ali Barada from الشرق الأوسط newspaper and from France 24. Talking about UN, more relevant UN, leads definitely to a question about the relevance of the General Assembly. Do you support empowerment of the General Assembly to give more meaning to its resolutions? As Abdul Hamid mentioned, recently there was a resolution adopted on the protection of the Palestinian people. Is it meaningless or does it have any meaning, and how? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Thank you, Madam President.
Well, one of my 7 priorities is about revitalizing the United Nations. This priority has 3 main issues that we will address during this session. One is the implementation of the reform agenda proposed by the Secretary General. I think that the purpose of the reform agenda is precisely to make this organization more efficient with a greater response capacity. So this is going to be hopefully the year for the implementation of the reform process. The second issue of this priority on revitalizing the United Nations is about giving a political push to the revitalization of the General Assembly process. The General Assembly is the most democratic and powerful organ of the multilateral system. 193 states have the same seats to sit, the same microphones to speak, and the same button to vote. I think that we should really take full use of this Parliament of Humanity. It is the norm-setting body for international coexistence. And I think that we have to make full use of the power of the General Assembly. I will personally be engaged with the revitalization process. And you ask about the very specific resolution on the Palestinian people. Yes, of course, I think that the reaction of the international community, for example, to the financial gap for UNRWA last week was extremely powerful. I think that the international community is aware of how important it is to deliver and comply with all existing resolutions regarding the Palestinian issue, and in this particular case, the protection to civilians and refugees.
We'll get 2 questions now. Pamela Falk, and then afterwards here. I'll go back there. Yes.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you.
Madam President, welcome and thank you very much for the briefing. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. You said the day you came out on your first day in office that one of the top priorities that will shape your presidency is gender equality. You're the first woman from Latin America as the president. You're the 4th woman in the history of the United Nations, and you've lived in a man's world as Minister of Defense. How are you going to do this, other than by example, to make sure that this issue comes to the fore in places other than like UN Women and great agencies that do it? How can you do it at the GA? Okay. Thank you.
Well, indeed, this is going to be one of my priorities. We have already established a strategy. We were working hand in hand with UN Women. I will, next time we meet, I will tell you exactly. I have some landmarks for the year. I want to tell you that my cabinet has in its entirety gender parity. Well, gender parity, we have much more women than men in my team. And yes, we have to lead by example. We have to walk the talk. That's obvious. We have 22 nationalities, and I don't know exactly the number, but highest number of women and men. I made sure that was the case. And we have a series of activities that we are planning for this year. we are going to look at the gender equality on every one of the 7 priorities that I have established. We have a program of work specifically on gender equality. I became one more of the gender champions within the House, and I will make sure that the voices of women and women's rights are fully taken into account in every activity of the General Assembly this year.
Okay, I'll lead it here.
Thank you, Madam President, and congratulations. I'm going to speak in Spanish. Mi nombre es Juliet Pineda.
My name, I'm a journalist from Caracas, Venezuela, and I wish to ask you, well, last week several presidents referred to the situation and the crisis which is currently being seen in the country. I wish to ask you what you think about that crisis, and if during your presidency you intend to champion mechanisms which might help to alleviate the crisis which is currently beleaguering Venezuela and Nicaragua. This was one of the issues discussed in the general debate.
And then I'm going to go see if you allow me, Madam President, to do other ones, so we have 2 questions together. Okay, go ahead, please. And I come back to Susan here. Please, yes, go ahead.
¿Qué tal? Mi nombre
My name is Isaac Garcia from Telesur. Congratulations on being elected president of the GA. I wanted to ask you 2 things. Firstly, for years, the United Nations has adopted a number of resolutions against the economic blockade imposed by the United States against Cuba. Is there any kind of mechanism to put pressure on to make the U.S. comply with the resolution? And I'd like to know what your view is on Bolivia coming to a close in there on the Security Council, serving on the Security Council.
Questions together, and then we go ahead to you. Okay, Madam President.
Well, I will address the issue of Venezuela. You want me to perhaps respond in Spanish? The question.
Yes, there is a translation.
Can you, the ones that...
Channel 1 for English.
Channel 1? Channel 1. Okay, for English translation. Entonces,
Let me answer the question on Venezuela and Nicaragua. You know that the agenda for the General Assembly is made up by the member states, and of course I'm following any developments in those 2 countries very closely. And the appeal that we send out is an appeal for dialogue, for a process of domestic reconciliation.
Yes, go ahead, Madam.
The peaceful resolution of disputes in accordance with international law, and I'm following very closely the development of the situation in both countries. There is ongoing dialogue between the United Nations, the Secretary General, and the authorities and the government of Nicaragua. It's a very promising dialogue, and we've also listened to the invitation from the government of Venezuela for there to be a visit from the High Commissioner for Human Rights to Venezuela. I think these are positive trends that the situation will return to calm, and assurances that in these 2 countries that normal life will be resumed and that people will be able to live in peace as they deserve. Turning to the question on the resolution on the economic embargo on Cuba, once again this year we're going to be looking at it again, and I believe there's unanimity among most of the member states who've spoken out against the embargo on Cuba. And this is the House, this is the place where we can discuss issues of this nature. And we've seen that many of the heads of state and government made a particular reference to the situation in Cuba and the very harmful impact that the embargo has on the people of Cuba and their rights. Bolivia is, in point of fact, today taking over the presidency as president of the Security Council, and I believe that it's quite common, customary in the House for there to be this monthly rotation among the presidents in the Security Council, and we'll be following what goes on in that very important body during this month. We will be watching the situation. There is going to be a coordination meeting between the Bolivian president and the president of the GA.
Okay, and then the colleague here. Okay, first, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Voy a continuar en español, si me...
Let me continue in Spanish, if I may, President. So far, you said that the debate between multilateralism and sovereignty is a compatible dialogue discussion, but the U.S. is the main financial contributor to this organization. It has taken actions. It's withdrawn from very important agreements, the Compact on Migration, the Paris Agreement, for example. Doesn't it make the work of this organization even more difficult and your job more difficult still? I believe it's very important to guarantee sustainable and predictable and long-term financing for this organization, and it is important for all member states to comply with their commitments. I think that's essential on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's true that at times consensus doesn't necessarily mean unanimity. There are instruments, there are countries which do not endorse, at least temporarily, or don't join in certain agreements that are established and that are adopted by the vast majority of members of the UN, or by members of the UN. It does occur. It has occurred with other multilateral instruments. It's rather disturbing, but we need to be open-minded and be tolerant to know that at a given point in time, a country may decide no longer to be part of a commitment, a consensus commitment on a particular instrument. We have to respect those differences, but we are very optimistic and hopeful because almost all of the members of the United Nations have committed to these instruments. That's a very clear case for the Global Compact on Migration or the Paris Agreement. There is broad majority consensus, almost complete consensus within the organization.
Then afterwards, Susan, so go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you, Madam President. Jian Gongwang from Xinhua News Agency. My question is easy. What are the three things or the top three achievements you think for the current high-level week? Yeah, thank you.
The three achievements. In my closing statement today at the General Assembly Hall, I outlined 7 achievements, but I will try and make it shorter. One issue, I would say, it is the global backing to the organization's work and to multilateralism. I think that we heard the voices of our leaders loud and clear that the United Nations are irreplaceable and that we need today, perhaps more than ever, to strengthen multilateralism because we need collective action to face current global challenges. One. Second, I think that this was the venue, the house. We were hosting hundreds of bilateral and regional meetings. This is not only about addressing the General Assembly, but it is about making agreements, establishing dialogues, making commitments from regional organization to bilateral context and dialogue. This was the house for universal dialogue for 1 week. And I think that already gives a lot of power and strength to the organization. And perhaps third, I would mention the enormous participation of civil society, activists, journalists, because this is all a space for dialogue among governments and among global leaders, but it is also the venue and the space for civil society to get together and establish a dialogue with our leaders, but also among them. And I think that we had an incredible number of people from around the world coming to support the UN agenda on the very critical issues such as climate change, such as oceans, such as the SDG agenda, et cetera, the disarmament agenda of the organization as well. I would cite just the three. There are much more, and you can look at my speech, my closing speech, where I highlight the 7 achievements of the high-level week.
We have time for a few more questions. I mean, brief questions. Susan, go ahead. Brenda, exactly. I've been calling you. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. My question is about, there was a resolution passed in the 1970s about what calls itself the UN Command. And the UN Command, we've recently heard from the administration of the UN, the UN has no oversight over that, no role in that. And the resolution passed in the 1970s, was that the UN Command should work out that it doesn't call itself that anymore. And so that's a resolution, but that has to do with the Korean Peninsula. And
the Korean Peninsula.
Yes, the important, and the signing of the armistice. That's one party that's a signature, but it had no role of the UN in that. It's a long and very important issue that, in fact, now has been raised as a problem interfering with the inter-Korean activities that are going on. And
Thank
so
you.
since there is a General Assembly resolution about this, and this was raised by the foreign minister of the DPRK, that this is a critical issue. I thought Moon Jae-in raised the importance of what's going on. It's not just the denuclearization of North Korea. It's a whole issue with regard to. So I wondered what your thinking is about how the General Assembly can be helpful to the process of the two Koreas working out the problems and getting support from the UN.
Thank you,
whereas
Brenda.
up to now, we haven't seen that support.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Well, I will have to, I want to be very frank, I will have to study the content of this particular resolution that you are mentioning, but what I can say is that any role of the General Assembly and the United Nations in general to facilitate and encourage dialogue among key actors for an overall peace process in the Korean Peninsula, I mean, we will do. Of course, this is part of our role, and I am with you. It is not only about denuclearization. It's about normality, and it is about a full-fledged relationship between the two Koreas.
A last question over there. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. Le quería...
Many thanks, Madam President. I wish to ask you about North Korea. I wanted to know if you had the opportunity to meet with the foreign minister of North Korea or anyone in that delegation. You also referred to the fact that you discussed that issue with President Trump. Now he says that now the General Assembly, or you said rather that the GA can perform any type of role. Did he discuss with you whether the GA was able to perform any role in denuclearization agreements? And if they were able to play such a role, what would that role be? The first part of the question, no, unfortunately I didn't hold a meeting with the authorities of North Korea. Quite simply because there was a lack of time. There was no other reason hindering that meeting. It was just a scheduling issue. Now, the second issue, which translation is working, English, Channel 1. And the second question, well, we didn't specifically discuss the role of the General Assembly, myself and Donald Trump. We dealt rather with the important role being played by the United States in the denuclearization of the process seeking to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula.
Free the room at 4. Thank you.
First of all, congratulations for the presidency. And can I ask you what you think about the Syria resolution right now? We have 7-8 million refugees and over 1 million people die, and now 4 million around Idlib. And what's going on? What do you think the solution after, all that meeting in the GA? Thank you.
Shall we take another?
Yes, and a last one very quickly here, and then we have to go, guys. We're going to have to do a second one. Yes, please, go ahead. Yes, thank you very much. I'm sorry about that. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm
Yes.
Altaf Najifzadeh from Bloomberg. I came from Afghanistan. I'm part of the RAF fellowship. I just two quick questions. What worried you after listening to all these speeches? I could say that which speech worried you a lot, and who gave the most contentious speech last week? Thank you.
Well, I think I would answer that question first, and then I will go back to you, sir. The truth is, as I mentioned at the beginning, I will not comment on the 196 speeches. I heard, an important number of them directly when I was chairing, but I read them and I had daily reports from my team. And it is hard to say which was the most contentious. I gave you, a very objective information on that, the longest and the shortest. And in terms of the content of the 196 speeches, I think it is up to you. We will do a general assessment of what were the key issues. I already have a first cut assessment, which is very encouraging because it speaks very well about the role of the United Nations and multilateralism, but also provides clear guidance for the work of the General Assembly during next session. What are the priorities? What are the concerns? The challenges that we are to address? But I think that was a very clever question. Regarding the Syria issue, I think that the Security Council has indeed the primary responsibility for the maintenance of peace and security. It is the Security Council's role, and it is my expectation that members of the Security Council will unite and exercise that responsibility. Of course, we're all concerned about the situation in Syria, and I really call on all parties to embark in a dialogue, in a constructive dialogue that will be beneficial for the Syrian people and for their well-being.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to thank you for coming. Thank you, first of all, Madam President, for this time. And we'll see you around. I hope so.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Just to thank UN News for the very nice video that they prepared for us today. With Nandita, so that was very, very, very nice and very good work from UN News. So thank you for that as well. And thank you for your presence this afternoon. See you all very soon.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.